I do not always elect presidents, but when I do it with the most convoluted way that I can. Or at least that's what people say about one of the most interesting institutions in the world, the Electoral College of the United States of America. What we're going to discuss today is why the framers created the Electoral College, whether the Electoral College is a quintessential expression of the contradictions of the American project, how unique it was at the time when it was created and how unique is it now, why we are stuck with it, and then your preferences for a possible change. Why the Electoral College? Or to put it in a different way, what was James Madison thinking? Since James Madison was essentially the most important of the framers of the Constitution. Now, many times when one wants to criticize some element of the US Constitution, they might go and blame James Madison's fixation with the classical world, classical Greece and Republican Rome. But I can assure you, as a cultural descendant of the ancient Greeks, that this is not really inspired by ancient examples. There is no such thing as an electoral college in classical Athens or in Republican Rome. Indeed, the Athenians considered elections to be the most base way of conducting business, something that you did instead of killing each other. They preferred sortition for making decisions, but we're not sorting among all of American people who the president will be. Maybe it was inspired by medieval or contemporary examples. The papal curia, through no white Anglo-Saxon Protestant like James Madison would ever clearly say that they were inspired by a popish Catholic institution, and the indirect elections to some institutions of the Ancien regime. If you don't know what the Ancien regime, it's roughly the system of government that existed in Europe between the 15th century and up to the French revolutions. Instead, there are three things that we can consider as being pivotal in the thinking of Madison and other framers in the creation of the Electoral College. First of all, there were checks and balances considerations. The popular election of both the President and the House of Representatives would make the American Constitution too democratic in their view. The Senate was not democratically elected back then. Senators were appointed by the state legislatures, and of course, the Supreme Court is appointed by the President. But if the President was popularly elected directly by the people, like the House of Representatives, 2 out of 4 key institutions of the American Constitution will be democratically elected. And many framers were worried about that. And that was because they had anti-democratic elitism. They viewed that the people are not equipped with the sagacity and wisdom to make a good choice about the president. Funnily enough, they did think that the people had the sagacity and wisdom for electing local representatives that then would elect the president, the so-called electors. And finally, racism. The slave states feared a popular election where the 3/5 compromise will not play a role. If you don't know what the 3/5 compromise is, it's the idea that for purposes of creating congressional representation for the states, especially in the House, 3/5 of people in bondage, of African American slaves, would count essentially as part of the population of a state. But in a general direct election of the president, that wouldn't play a role because African American slaves did not have the right to vote. The Electoral College, by giving states as many electors as they have members of Congress, each state has essentially 2 electoral votes from the Senate and as many electoral votes as House of Representatives members they have. The Electoral College permitted the 3/5 compromise to still operate and provided the South with much more representation in the election of the president than they would have in a direct popular election. Let's consider the contradictions of the American project expressed in the Electoral College. There was a debate of virtual representation versus actual representation. One of the causes of the American Revolution, one of the things castigated in Thomas Paine's Common Sense that mobilized American colonies to fight against the British Crown, was the idea of virtual representation, which was a dominant way of thinking for the British Parliament, was wrong. In virtual representation, the parliamentarian is not considered as a representative of the constituency, but in generally a representative of the nation, and is considered free to vote as they want on matters, even if that contravened the ideas and will of their constituents. That was anathema for the Americans who believed in actual representation. that representatives should represent the people who vote them, their constituency, and should be held accountable by those people. When the Electoral College initially was thought, many framers hoped that the electors will essentially vote at will, with no care about the wishes of the people who voted for them. That was quickly shelved by the American populace, who demanded that the electors vote according to the will of the people. Then you have the debate between checks and balances versus popular will. America is a Republican democracy. It is a republic that has many checks and balances that essentially put brakes on the popular will, but ultimately the people are sovereign. The Electoral College was a way to dilute, hopefully, in the view of the framers, the ability of the people's will to be fully interpreted by the president, essentially a break on the right of the president to claim that they represented the people and had the right to do what they wanted for their good. Then we had federalism versus nationhood. Was the United States of America a federation of distinct states, or was it one nation that simply organized itself according to in different states? Federalism back then had, of course, an element of slavery and racism, since the main sectional interest that was caring about state rights and state sovereignty were the slave states. And then is the question of rule by the people versus rule for the people. These are two different things. Rule by the people entails that the popular will, through elections, directly influences policy. Rule for the people entails that politicians, especially the president, the members of Congress, have the right to come up with what they think is the best for the people, even if sometimes that disagrees with the current popular mood. And finally, the fear of faction versus reality of politics. It was hoped that the Electoral College will make it harder for factions to arise. Of course, that was a very foolish hope. Madison recognized that democracy is the very oxygen for faction. The reality of politics was that very quickly the Electoral College became another partisan tool in the competition between American parties. Was it that unique then? Is it still unique? Compared to the contemporary alternatives in the 18th century, it was a much more streamlined and simple institution. Case in point, electing the Doge of the Serene Republic of Venice. Have fun. In Venice, you had the Maggior Concilio, which was the great council of the nobility, which had about 400 to 500 members. When it came to electing the Doge, 30 people from that Maggior Concilio were chosen by random lot, by sortition. Then out of those 39 were chosen by random lot. Those 9 then voted for 40 members of the Maggior Concilio, who then by sortition were reduced to 12. Those 12 then voted for 25 members of the Maggior Concilio, who then by sortition was sorted, reduced to 9. Those 9 then voted for 45 members of the Maggior Concilio, who then by sortition were reduced to 11, who then voted for 41 members of the Quarantia, who voted for the Doge. A very complicated system. It will be funny to consider how American politics will be different if such a system had been put in place for electing the president. But that was not the case. It was decided to just have a much more simple system where the people will vote for ad hoc electors that then will vote for the president. In the modern era, America is not the only country that has an electoral college. France elects its Senate with an electoral college made up of local government officials. In India and Pakistan, the heads of states are elected by the Electoral College, mixing legislative and federal state powers. In another name, there are electoral colleges around, but they are not the same as the Electoral College of the United States of America. The people don't vote for electors. Instead, the electors come from pre-existing institutions, whether that is local government, in the US that will be state or county governments, or whether there is a mix of the legislative and federal state powers, as is India and Pakistan. Many want to change the Electoral College. They find it archaic, undemocratic, and as we pointed out, there's an element of truth to that. But we're stuck with it. States still play a role in US identity, especially in polarized times. People tend to politically identify with California or New York or Texas or Florida as ways of running your state government. So people still care about states and they would like to see the role of states not completely expunged from the federal government. Secondly, there's a fear of dominance of the presidency by major population centers. The map that you see there shows what will happen if there were elections without electoral college. Essentially, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, the biggest population states in the United States of America, will determine the president. Now, right now, California, New York, and Texas and Florida hate each other, so it's very unlikely that they will collaborate to get the president. But never underestimate the ability of people to come up with ways to dominate a political system. Amending it, and it will require a constitutional amendment, would open questions of state power in the national government. It's very likely that states will demand something in return for losing their power within the Electoral College. That probably will be the repeal of the 17th Amendment. The repeal of the 17th Amendment will mean that senators are not elected by you, the people, anymore, but instead they are elected by your local representatives, by the legislature. Then there's the partisan fear of being swamped by the other side. Republicans see the Electoral College as protection against a larger population that tends to be Democrat or Democrat-leaning. So there's an opposition to that. In other scenarios, the Democrats might equally fear that. Now, the problems that many raise when they question whether the Electoral College should exist are not as big as people make them to be. The fear of faithless electors is a marginal issue. Most states prohibit electors from voting in a different way than what the majority popular vote in the state was. And even if they didn't, think about it. If you are an elector who essentially betrays the trust of your fellow citizens, you're not going back home. You better have made sure that you get a federal job by the winner of the presidential elections, because you're not going back home. In the 18th century, you will be tarred and feathered, potentially killed. In the 21st century, you will probably be shunned and excluded from your local community. Finally, only 6% of the time has the result of the popular vote not been represented in the result of the Electoral College. Most of the time, 94% in presidential elections, the winner of the popular vote has also won the Electoral College. Finally, any change will require a bargain. Many are not willing to contemplate, and we're going to test whether you're willing to contemplate some of those bargains. So here's your task. Let us say that there has been a decision to call a constitutional convention to change the Electoral College. As I said, any amendment will be the result of a bargain. No one is going to get exactly what they want. Let's say that there are 4 options put forward for the people's representatives or the states to vote on to change it. The first one, the president is elected by popular vote, but the 17th Amendment is repealed. No Electoral College, the president is directly voted by the people, but the people lose the right to vote for the senators directly. It goes back to the legislators, to the state legislators. Number 2, the president is elected by popular vote, but must also win the popular vote in 50% of the states. The 17th Amendment remains, since states now have still influence. There's no Electoral College. You have to win 51% of the popular vote, but you must also win at least 25 states in order to become the president. Number 3, the president is voted by the Electoral College, but this is now made up of 50 randomly chosen members of Congress and the federal judiciary and the legislatures of states, each state having 1 vote. So more like the Indian and the Pakistani system. The 17th Amendment remains. And finally, so the president is not elected by the people anymore. Here, he's elected by essentially a college created by 50 sorted members of Congress and the federal judiciary and by the legislatures of the states. And number 4, the president is voted by the popular vote, but must win a supermajority of the votes, 60%. You can't win anymore by just 51%. The 17th Amendment is again repealed. States take back some of their power by making senatorial elections done by the legislature.